Recording in progress.
Good afternoon, colleagues. I just want to get a sense, please. Am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Excellent. Thank you, Tomani. Colleagues, everyone present here today, my name is Esther Sapto. I am Senior Researcher in the Intergovernmental and Resource Matters Cluster. Thank you so much for joining us here today in what we are essentially anticipating just to be a knowledge sharing session this afternoon. Amongst peers, colleagues, and also we have had registration from honorable members. If there are any members here on the platform today, I also want to extend a special word of thank you. So colleagues, the objective of this webinar today is really to just have an informed discussion on what progress South Africa has made towards meeting its goals under the Paris Climate Change Agreement. We're going to be looking at three issues in particular. So as part of the discussion, we will reflect on South Africa's plans and progress on food systems, climate disaster resilience, and climate finance. And the aim is really just to prepare members or the members of our delegation to COP28. As you may be aware, COP28 is scheduled to take place from the 30th of November until the 12th of December in the United Arab Emirates, Dubai, to be specific. So in terms of the program, the way that we want to do this is to really just have one of our colleagues in conversation about the three topics. We will precede that with an input by our acting chief researcher, Ms. Nadia Dolly, who will be just giving us an overview of how our whole webinar series connects with or gives effect to Parliament's knowledge management strategy. After that, Joseph will be in conversation with Ms. Nontobeko Twabe, with Tomani Manungufala, and then with Jeannie Leroux around the three issues that I highlighted. So Nontobeko will be contributing to the climate change and food systems, Jeannie, climate disaster preparedness, and then Tomani will touch on climate finance. So when we decided on people to speak here today as part of our program colleagues, we didn't do it lightly. We basically went to experts in the field, and luckily they reside within the research unit. Ms. Nontobeko Twabe is an experienced researcher, and she has a passion for food security initiatives and a proven track record of success in the sector, in the legislative sector. She is skilled in agriculture and rural development. She also holds a master's degree in agricultural science and rural development planning from the University of Pretoria. Jeannie also holds a master's degree in environmental management, and she has more than 10 years experience in the environmental NGO sector. I think Jeannie joined the research unit quite a couple of years ago. She has provided support to different committees in the National Council of Provinces specifically. At present, Jeannie provides support to the Select Committee on Land, Environmental Affairs, Energy and Mineral Resources. I'm not sure that I get the name proper, but that is the areas that the committee covers. Tomani is an environmental scientist, and he specializes in natural resources management and governance. He's a researcher, he's a published author, and he's also a thought leader in the area of sustainable development. Currently, Tomani is doing his PhD in geography at Stellenbosch University, where he's investigating traditional leadership and water resources governance. His current research interests include equitable, just, and sustainable water and energy future in the global south. Also, our acting chief researcher, Nadia Dolly, as I said, who will be speaking to us a bit about the link between our webinar series and Parliament's knowledge management strategy, is no newbie to the field. Ms. Dolly completed a master's degree also in knowledge management, so she knows what she's talking about. Colleagues, honorable members, all our participants here, I don't want to take up too much time, but just to say that, so what will happen is Nadia will give her input. After that, Joseph will be in conversation with the three researchers whom I just highlighted. You will be able to post questions and comments in the box between myself, Kolosa, who's our administrative assistant, and Joseph. We will be trying to keep an eye on your comments and try to respond as we go along. Can I also just let you know that there will, after the panel discussion, be a dedicated session where you can ask questions, and that will be an interactive session where the panelists will respond to your questions then. So yeah, let me just invite you to relax, sit back, and please enjoy the session with us. I'll give over to Nadia. Thank you, Nadia.
Thank you, Esther. Welcome to all, and thank you for attending this webinar. Parliament's strategic plan recognises that the effectiveness of Parliament requires enhanced capacity and deeper insights for its members. The objective is to ensure that Parliament is effective in holding government to account and ensuring the responsiveness of government to the needs of the people. One of the strategies to enhance the capacity of members and staff and to deepen insights is the knowledge management strategy. The KM strategy recognises that parliaments are largely driven by knowledge and information. How we harness, generate, and share this knowledge and information becomes key to how effective we are in ensuring that MPs have all the information at their disposal, packaged in a digestible way that enables them to make informed decisions. The seminar program in Parliament is a core component of the KM strategy. So focus area 2 of the strategy deals with knowledge generation and sharing. The seminar program is one of the key initiatives that enables the sharing of knowledge, information, and perspectives between administrative support staff, members of Parliament, and civil society. The seminar program provides for capacity building of both the staff appointed to assist MPs as well as MPs themselves. Going forward, this seminar program will be even more closely linked to the focused oversight priorities identified by Parliament. Oversight over these critical priorities should be embedded in the programs of committees and the houses. It's important that we use the seminar program platform to share and discuss issues and perspectives that are identified as critical to improving the lives of South Africans and to ensuring the realization of the National Development Plan. This particular webinar on COP28 clearly fits in with this imperative. In recognition that expertise resides within Parliament and not only with outside academics and researchers, the presenters and discussants are all parliamentary staff who have specialized knowledge and expertise in the areas that they will discuss. Once again, thank you for attending this webinar, and I look forward to learning a lot from this incredible panel of parliamentary researchers who will be sharing their insights with us. Thank you.
You're muted, Esther.
Sorry. Thank you, Joseph. I thank you, Nadia, for those insightful comments. I think I will just hand over to Joseph without further ado. Joseph, part of it will also be just an introduction of your background, please. And yeah, colleagues, please just sit back, relax, and have fun with us this afternoon while we share. Thank you. Thanks, Joseph.
Okay, good afternoon, colleagues, honorable members, and everybody else. Thank you very much for taking your time to be part of us in this important discussion around climate change. We know that climate change is a serious problem or serious concern that has been building up gradually over the years. When we look back from around 1950s, it was already becoming clear that the emissions from those industrialization period were going somewhere. And unfortunately, the outcomes, you don't experience them overnight. And it's been a gradual accumulation of those greenhouse gases over the period to where we are today. Fortunately, as the greenhouse gases behave, there's a warming of the planet that we are in, and there's associated impact linked to the planetary systems, and they are affecting human lives. And unfortunately, given the nature of emissions that we've been having, they don't always affect the one who's emitting them according to the proportion which they are emitting. We find that the industrialized countries, whether it's from the US or from China or from Russia, any of those countries, their emissions affect others on the extreme end. And unfortunately, the way things are, Africa is the country, or is the continent that is worst affected, including other small islands and least developed countries. That is where it becomes even more challenging, because now we are all required to adapt to the realities of climate change going forward. And we have lots of challenges that need to be resolved around the impacts of climate change, particularly the extreme weather events that affect the ecosystem, that affect nature, the way we ecosystem interactions, the way people relate to each other, they affect livelihoods of people. The impacts are far and wide, and countries vary in their abilities to adapt to these new realities or to build resilience. And all these, they require finances. And there are different studies that point to finances being the major stumbling block to climate change adaptation or mitigation, which is why at this point we will take it to the panelists who will be taking us through and enlightening us in some of these issues that are related to climate change, whether it's the financing side of things, whether it's the food systems that is being affected, or whether it's the disasters. And in all this, South Africa has been experiencing disasters after disasters. And of lately, like in the past 5 years in particular, there's been efforts around climate finance and mobilization of funds. And then you also have various government departments from national down to municipalities trying to be involved in one way or the other in the food systems. So we'll be diving into those ones. But before we get into those details, let's go into the climate finance landscape. Tomani, how have we been doing so far? What is the background that you can lay as we go into that question?
Thank you, Joseph. Thank you very much for that introduction. The issue around climate finance is very complex. And it's an issue that I think I will take from your introduction, that it goes with the capabilities. So there is a principle within the Paris Agreement that talks to differentiated responsibilities and capabilities. Yet we are common, but we do not have similar responsibilities. We don't have similar capabilities. So if you may also look at individuals, we do not have same capabilities and also responsibilities. So climate finance globally is approached in that sense, where the developed countries are expected to support the developing countries with financial resources to enable them to build resilience, adaptive capacity, and also to adapt to climate change impacts. And most importantly, reducing and also eliminating their own greenhouse gas emissions. And all these actions are known as climate action. And we all know that to do all this, you need money, you need finances, you need funds. And at a global level, then we have got a number of operating entities that are hosted at a UN level. That is the Global Environmental Facility, the Green Climate Fund, the Adaptation Fund. And the aim of Adaptation Fund really is to help developing countries to improve their resilience and also to adapt to climate change. So all these facilities were established initially to serve the Kyoto Protocol. And in 2015, when the parties came together to come up with Paris Agreement, that is when then now the mandates or the principles around these entities were changed now also to serve the Paris Agreement. And of course, I think 2015 was a turning point in climate finance, because at that time, then the tangible and measurable financial targets were set and harmonized, which really put the climate finance at another level. So in other words, it was much more organized than before. And supplement this or to provide substance to this commitment, the parties agreed that they will jointly contribute or mobilize $100 billion by 2020, which will be used to address the needs of developing countries. Unfortunately, this target was not met, but then the target was changed to 2025. And of course, I think last week I read somewhere where there is a report that actually this target has been met, which means that now globally the countries have managed to raise this 100 billion, which will go towards developing countries to address their needs insofar as climate change is concerned. And this we have seen also being made applicable in the Sustainable Development Goals, in particular the SDG 13, which deals with climate action. So in other words, this was really an indication that the world has realized how important it is to have climate change or climate finance addressed at all dimensions of United Nations. So that is in a nutshell something that it's worth noting. But of course, with this 100 billion target being met, there are people out there who are saying that it's not actually met, but it's an issue of mathematics. It's issue of calculations. In other words, they have some countries converted some of the things that perhaps loans that they've given out as loans, but now they have now changed the agreements or the credits to somehow to grants. Then obviously when they calculate, then it becomes 100 billion. So insofar as South Africa is concerned, South Africa is not an island. It's also expected to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And as we know, in the continent is the highest emitter in the African continent. And at the very same time, we are expected to build resilience and reduce vulnerability to the impacts of climate change. And to meet all these expectations, South Africa has come up with a number of legislations and strategies. And some of them really deals with the issues that some of my colleagues or the other panels are going to deal with, issues of disaster and the issues around food security. So all of these policies and strategies requires finance. So in other words, we need a lot of money really to address issues of disasters. As you've seen in the past, I think 2 years, we have been ravaged really with disasters, floods, and all of that across the country. And also, insofar as climate finance is concerned in South Africa, it's being done through two important aspects that I would like to highlight before delving into other nitty-gritties. The Just Energy Transition Framework, which really it aims to transition the country to a sustainable and low carbon economy or net zero, where the future is climate resilient. And South Africa is benefiting from climate finance from the entities that I've indicated earlier on, the Global Environmental Facility and the Green Climate Fund, immensely through this program of Just Transition. And to that end, then South Africa has developed or established what we call a Just Transition Partnership, Just Energy Transition Partnership. And this is also funded through the partnership that we have seen from the European Union, France, Germany, United Kingdom, United States of America. Apologies about that. And the pledge that has come from this partnership, it's around 8.5 billion, which is going towards transition activities, particularly in the energy sector. So it is something that it's going to propel South Africa towards this important goal of transitioning from coal-generated electricity. And it's also worth to note that there is also a green fund which facilitates also transition to green economy in the country, where the market forces do not adequately value the cost to the environment of their businesses. So this is something that I think I need to highlight before going into the actual detail in terms of discussions, because this green fund was established around 2012, way before the Paris Agreement, and to deal with the issues of green economy. And the seed funding there came from National Treasury at a tune of 1.1 billion, and it was donated to the Department of Forestry, Fisheries and the Environment to deal with this issue, and it was also being managed by DBSA. So that is, in a nutshell, some of the issues that I think are worth noting, just to open also to provide background in issues of climate finance. I think at this point, it's worth also to note that South Africa has a number of accredited institutions that are eligible to receive funding from the entities that I've mentioned above, which this is the Development Bank of Southern Africa and the South African National Biodiversity Institute. And there are a couple of monies that we have received so far through some of this. If I may mention a few of them, that is the $180 million from the the Green Climate Fund, as well as the $10 million from the Adaptation Fund to fund projects that are administered by the South African National Biodiversity Institute. So these are some of the things that I think are worth noting from the outset, that this is something that is how finance is being rolled out in South Africa. At this point, Joseph, let me pause here and allow the other panelists to come in, and then give an opportunity to you as the program director to direct us in the way forward. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Tumani, for that background and overview and a little bit of context around the history, how things have developed around the financing of climate action. So one of the things that has been observed recently is the extreme levels of weather events that we are experiencing as a country. And let's say, for example, we are considering between 2015 and today, we have lost so many people as a result of climate-driven mortalities and infrastructure damage and all this and that. So, Jenny, would you please paint us a picture of the observations around the climate-driven disasters?
Thank you very much, Joseph and colleagues. I appreciate it. I think you're 100% correct. We've had so many major climate disasters in the last few years. I think if I have to single out two, the 2017 Knysna fires and the floods last year in KwaZulu-Natal come to mind. The intensity, the scale, the severity of it, the extent to which disaster recovery efforts were required to address these challenges were enormous. And I think that there were important lessons that we could learn from these events. I think if I can highlight a few areas, I think underlying to all of the disaster response efforts, in cooperative governance comes to mind. It's been a golden thread throughout all of the efforts as a major challenge faced by government and coordinating disaster responses. Then in South Africa, because of the realities that we have, with poverty and people like South Africa being an urbanizing country, a lot of people settle in areas that are high risk areas like floodplains, and especially due to the high density of settlements, especially in informal areas. It creates a major challenge in terms of responding to disasters and the number of people affected in events like fires and flooding. I think the poor performance of local government is another major issue. It was interesting to note in the report by the ad hoc joint committee on the floods working in KwaZulu-Natal, that they found that a lot of the major impacts of the flooding in KwaZulu-Natal could have been prevented quite easily just by basic proper local government services being provided, like clearing out blockages in drains, or better floodplain management with wetlands, for example, things that are relatively inexpensive to get right. But because the basics at local government are in many areas a major challenge, they all contribute to the impact and the scale and severity of the impact of these weather events. So I think inadequate environmental management is also an area worth noting. And then communication and coordination in these events, and a lack of funding, like Tamani also pointed out, or otherwise the ineffective application of funds. One of the things that were highlighted in that same report was that some of the NGOs that receive funding from government to respond to these disasters, especially in relation to the flooding in KwaZulu-Natal, a lot of these NGOs were not visible on the ground, even though they received funding from government. So there are some major challenges just from a governance perspective that South Africa can address, that will already make improvements to our ability to respond to these natural disasters. I think the scale of these and the management of these, like from a preventative point of view, is also important to note. There was a very interesting study commissioned and completed by the CSIR, the Council for Scientific and Industrial Research, in 2019, looking at vegetation types in South Africa, and they narrowed it down to three ecological vegetation types in relation to fire, and how they respond to fire, how they rely on fire for their existence and to thrive, but then also some of the ecological areas that are more at risk, and struggle to recover afterwards. And one of the things that was pointed out in that report was that managing the fuel load, for example, the availability of material that can burn and continue to feed these wildfires, is directly relates to the type of fire ecology of a region. And agricultural practices, when you have monocultures, for example, the risk for a higher fuel load and therefore material that can continue to fuel the fire is also, it's something that plays an enormous role. And then you have the reality of some of the structures that are put in place that follow municipal or provincial boundaries, but not necessarily ecological boundaries. So there is a need for incorporating more regional and ecological geographical areas when one looks at disaster response, because it has proven to be a major challenge in the past with rapid response to some of these challenges, and especially in terms of wildfires. It's quite different to general disaster management and general disaster responses, because there are different legislative functions between national, provincial, and local governments, with firefighting services, for example, being a local government competency, but it's not specified as a basic service. Therefore, it means that that function does not receive ring-fence funding or funding in form of a specific grant, but rather that municipalities have to fund that function and perform that function with funds that they generate through their normal levies and taxes at a local level. And we all know that with challenges being faced by local municipalities, the lack of availability of funding means that there's definitely not enough, just in terms of firefighting, for example, there's not enough funding being allocated to these functions. So yes, I hope I answered your question, but I think in short, there are quite a few areas where South Africa's ability to respond to these disasters can be improved. And I don't know if I mentioned it at the beginning, but disaster response is the primary responsibility of the Department of Cooperative Governance and Traditional Affairs. And we have the Disaster Management Act as well of 2002, which serves as the primary legislation for disaster management. But the regulatory environment is much more complex because you have so many different role players. We also have the National Defence Force, for example, that also fulfills its duty during these times of extreme disasters.
Thank you very much, Jean. It's really a concern, more especially when you talk about, for example, fires. I remember there was an issue that was raised around fires that are spread from, let's say, from Botswana being blown into the northwest of South Africa. That the Botswana firefighters, they would fight the fire until the border fence, or the border between the two countries, the boundary. Then it becomes a baby for South Africa in that instance. But that was not only the only issue, because you find that also sometimes the vegetation, as you were highlighting, sometimes it's almost the same. Like the areas that have lots of livestock, then you have these fires escaping from one municipality to another municipality, or from one district to another, and sometimes even from one province to another. Like there was that fire that ran away from northwest right into Gauteng, the Mapungupe area there, and like the forest fire is also nice now because it's in that area. So yeah, thank you very much for that background. It's one of the issues that I will be following up on as we continue with our discussion. But Nontobeko, Jenny touched on the impact of climate change on the agricultural sector, although she was focusing on one aspect. Like from South Africa's perspective, the composition of farmers, we have smallholder farmers that are making up a large number of farmers compared to the big commercial farmers, and all of them are affected by climate change. So paint us a picture how climate change in the agricultural sector is affecting the different farmers and in that space, including like the food systems, because now it's no longer just looked at as farmers, looked at in holistically, which is why now there's more drive towards looking at things from that what we traditionally consider to be agriculture in a food systems approach. Take us through that.
So good day, colleagues. Good day to the other panelists and members on the platform. Thank you, Joseph. So when we speak of food systems,
apologies, your video is still off.
Yes, I won't be able, sorry, apologies. I won't be able to put it on because I have not been able to update the app, and then now there's a bit of a glitch there. My apologies.
Okay, it's fine, you can go ahead.
Yes. So I was saying, so when we speak of food systems, we should be thinking of the entire agricultural value chain, but all the way throughout the processing of food, throughout the entire retail system, and how all of that is integrated, and whatever the impact on the environment at every point, how that can be, mitigated against, how we can try to adapt or change or shift some of the practices. I think Jeannie was trying to get into that space. And I certainly concur with her from that perspective. And just to set the scene, that it is a well-established reality that climate change has an increasing impact on not just local value chains, agricultural value chains and the food systems, but also on a global level. We've seen this more recently, for example, whether it was changes in weather patterns in South America, who produce quite substantial volumes of food for the global markets. But we've also seen it when there's other challenges such as COVID, how a disruption in the global supply chains actually had a reverberating impact on the rest of us, whether it was on the price of wheat, of rice, of seed oils. We've seen even more recently now, even with issues such as war, how that can have an impact on the supply of food across the globe. So in as much as we think food systems and climate change, but we should also be cognizant that there's many other risk factors or prevailing conditions that actually impact food systems beyond just climate. So when we think, we need to definitely think more holistically and more broader when we speak of food systems. So what we know for sure from the agricultural sector is that the agricultural practices themselves have been also highlighted to be a contributor to significant greenhouse gas emissions. So that is one area that needs to be addressed. But also looking at the different production systems you're speaking of in South Africa, for example, we have your mega farms, super large scale commercial farmers who we would want to say they are the main culprits of impacting negatively on the environment. But also when you look in terms of who supplies the food, the agricultural value chain, and therefore into the retail markets, commercial farmers and mega farmers dominate that space. And then you have, on the other hand, smallholder farmers, small scale, or even subsistence farmers, who in the main, they produce to feed their families, they produce to feed, to supply the local markets. When I say local, I mean like micro scale markets. But with that, you also find that it is the very same smallholder farmers who have more sustainable practices in terms of how the food is produced. But because they have more sustainable practices, there's also a sense of a delinking from the formalized agricultural value chain and the food system, as it were. So maybe there's some kind of schism there that we also need to reflect on, and how it seems with the more formalized systems, we promote unsustainable practices, and then the sustainable practices are delinked by, there's many reasons why it is delinked, but I think from a South African perspective, it's a schism that we can look at and see how to close that kind of a gap towards, more sustainable food systems. Also, the other thing is, it is also difficult. I think there's over 1.5 million smallholder farmers in South Africa, as compared to about 40,000 commercial farmers. But when you look at literature and when you look at a lot of studies, there's been very little that's been done to say how then do we leverage, this 1.5 million number, which we could develop into a critical mass of sustainable producers, and therefore turn the tide in how the agricultural sector contributes towards, now in a positive way, contributes towards reducing the greenhouse gas emissions. But also we find very limited evidence that seeks to support, valuable policy dialogue in terms of what can happen, what is possible within that space. And I think, like I was saying earlier, I think that's an important space for South Africa to look at. If you look at now, to tie in with some of what Tumani was speaking about, a lot of the financing, for example, for farmers to go off the grid, it's financing that's available to commercial farmers because they've got a long track record with the banks and all of that, fair and fine. But I think even some of the schemes that have been introduced to incentivize farmers to go off the grid, it has not been designed in mind with how a smallholder producer would function and how that production system could rely on organic manure, solar energy, and that kind of thing. So we have a lot that's going on, but there seems to be a glancing over this critical mass, what could be a critical mass of sustainable producers in the country. And some of the things that have been introduced to try now to pivot commercial farmers away from, high greenhouse gas emissions has been, let's try to reintroduce at the retail side now, let's try to reintroduce more indigenous food crops, whether it's sorghum, it's millet, and those types of things. But also there's been a slow turnaround. It's very at a micro level. There's no serious concerted campaign or effort that says, we know there's quite a large number of farmers, for example, in KZN who do amadumbe, right? And that could be a starch staple to replace maize, for example, in the diets of South Africans at a local level. But you hardly ever see that as a serious drive towards saying, let's diversify the food sources, let us eat more indigenous and more local food types. Our food system is still very much geared towards export orientation. We produce everything to export, not everything, but the majority of our agricultural produce, we produce that for export markets. And what we have a shortage of in the country, we are geared towards, instead of building some local level capacity, we are geared more towards importing that. A good example more recently would be with the avian flu outbreak, and how one of the immediate responses is to let's import chickens from wherever we could find them, the EU, Brazil, and the like. But that too is a contributor to this whole problem that we are speaking of, because for those chickens to be raised in whatever part of the world, and for them to, the agri-logistics that are involved in getting all of that all the way down here to us. It's good to have an open economy and to be able to trade, but I think we need to balance the trade aspect of what we produce and what we consume with the footprint, the carbon footprint of the food that we eat. I think I tried to emphasize on how smallholder farmers can be deemed to be sustainable producers. So we definitely need, stronger emphasis around that. There's been some effort, even if on a global scale, some effort to try and reduce post-harvest losses. And I think it's not a topic that we focus a lot on, but it's quite important, because you'll find if out of a ton of vegetable or fresh produce, if out of a ton of that, if only 60% of that makes it to the retail supply chain, then you've lost about 40%. So all the water, all the chemicals and everything else, so the impact on the environment that you've put out there, the externalities, as it were. But if you only consume the 60% that's remaining, so there's been a 40% waste, not just waste of the food, but also waste in terms of how you utilize resources within the system. I think I've tried to touch on renewable energy. I think it's still early stages for us as a country, but I think there is something there that we could build upon. So yeah, I think lastly, as a parting shot, I think for Parliament, I'm glad that we are having this discussion as Parliament, but I think Parliament does have a role to, of course, to monitor how the laws and the policies and even the international agreements that we are part of, how those, in detail now, how they can be used to incentivize sustainable and low carbon agricultural practices. So yeah, I'll park it there for now. Thank you.
Yeah, I'll come back to the ones relating to Parliament. But what is clear now from the input that has been made is that there's lots of cross-cutting issues that are linked to climate change in this space. Like, for example, it's been from the discussions in Morocco, there was that drive that, no, let us also prioritize the food systems, the people that are affected by that. Because, like, as Ntobeki was saying, with climate change, some of the unintended consequences is that we may end up importing other foods that we traditionally had the capacity to produce on ourselves. And that is a serious concern, and including the impacts of that climate change has on the spread of diseases and all this. But going to the point around the focus of discussions at COP, one of the thorny issues or area of contention was around the liabilities, if we may simplify it like that, from the climate disasters as part of a way of financing the impact or climate-related impact in communities or in countries that have not contributed significantly. I know that it was one of those grudgingly accepted input into the final documents, although some countries, including South Africa, were pushing very hard that the loss and damages should be there. Thomas, what is your take on the establishment of the loss and damage fund?
Thank you, Joseph, for that context. This is, like you have indicated, a very contagious issue. It's a very contested aspect of the negotiations. And coming out of the COP27, the countries in principle agreed to establish a loss and damage fund. And then they established a committee. I think it was chaired by South Africa, and I think it's Finland, if I'm not, if I'm correct. So now, building towards COP28, this committee has come up with final details of that agreement of loss and damage fund. And one of the contagious issues around that, or the issues, contested issues around the loss and damage fund, was the issue around the who is going to contribute, and how are they going to contribute, and who's going to host the fund. So that was something that was very important, and it goes on with one of the questions that I've seen from our former chief there online, talking about the issues of free rider mentality. So that is something that this committee has to contend with, because no one wanted to take responsibility to say, I'm going to contribute to this fund. But that being the case, this committee has established the final details and the agreement. The proposal is on the table now, which will be taken to COP28 to be discussed and agreed upon. And one thing that has appeared in that agreement is that the fund will be hosted by the World Bank. And as we know, World Bank is dominated by the United States of America. And to an extent that they are responsible for appointing the presidents of that bank. And majority of developing countries are not happy with this arrangement because they know transacting with World Bank is very expensive. So they fear that the fund being hosted at this bank may make it very difficult for them to access the funds, and also it may be very expensive for them to get the funds from it. And also it may discourage other developed countries to deposit money for the benefit of the developing countries at World Bank, as it's seen as something that is a proxy to the United States of America. So that is the issue around the establishment of loss and damage. And of course, it's a very important fund, particularly for the African continent, because currently for us, if one has to say this, although it's a very controversial issue, is that the African continent, it's bearing the brunt of climate change. Yet they are the least contributors to the causes of this climate change. And the situation is getting worse. We are experiencing disasters week in, week out now. And we need the monies to do it. We can't do it with our National Revenue Fund. So, but unless this fund comes to play, it's going to be very difficult for the continent at large, and in particular our country, to deal with the impacts of climate change, in particular disasters. So that is where it is at now, insofar as loss and damage is concerned. But it's a very, very important aspect of climate change adaptation and mitigation in the African continent and other developing countries. Thank you, Joseph.
Yeah, I think the finances are going to be a big issue. And, you know, like when we look also at a country level, South Africa, we, as Parliament, we always process these reports. And every year from the Auditor General and the Statistician General, you get this picture that there are issues that need to be attended to before maybe South Africa can be in a position of receiving that money. When you look, for example, at our municipalities, let's say preparing for a disaster or mitigating a disaster, there are some of inefficiencies that are in our system that require to be addressed. Because, for example, if you are going to have, let's say it's the 1.5 trillion or the 6 trillion rand being thrown at South Africa from the World Bank, then how are we going to manage that all the way down to municipality? And this takes me to the next point, Jin, with how have we been trying to improve our effectiveness and efficiencies as it relates to disasters, particularly around the preparedness and recovery? Because like in some of the areas where we've had disasters, there are still no bridges built, and it's now years that have passed. There are still roads that have not been restored. There are still municipal infrastructure like wastewater treatment plants. How have we been doing that from that front?
I think at a legislative level, South Africa has been doing rather well in trying to respond to some of the challenges being experienced. I think you know, we approved the low emissions development strategy in 2020. We are currently reviewing the national framework for disaster risk management. We have the national climate change adaptation strategy of 2019. We look at the climate change bill that's currently being processed by Parliament, and this has just been referred to the National Council of Provinces. And then we have the National Veld and Forest Fire Bill, which was introduced to the National Assembly in December 2021, and which is now currently being processed by the NCOP as well. And then the development of the white paper on fire services in 2020. So I think at a legislative level, South Africa has responded to, has attempted to respond to a lot of these things. But at a practical and local level, as you mentioned, we have not been faring very well in practice with realities on the ground. And I think there are so many areas that require urgent intervention in order for us to improve our ability to respond to natural disasters. And also when we receive funding to respond to these, that we are in a better position and that we have the capacity to effectively respond to them. Some of the areas where we can improve are relatively inexpensive and simple. If we think of improving environmental management, for example, it comes down to, for flood management, for example, it comes down to, at a local level, not approving developments in floodplains, or where we have, natural systems that serve as buffers for flooding risks, like wetlands, that we rehabilitate these, and that we don't allow development in these areas. And that we don't, that we ensure that the rivers that we do have follow their natural course, because we tend to make the lines straighter and to conform to roads and infrastructure in an urban setting. But with that, you also have an impact on flooding, and you're increasing your risk for flooding. A lot of these environmental principles should be streamlined and mainstreamed into development and building conditions, especially in areas that are prone to natural disasters. And something simple, which is relevant in both cases to drought and, for example, fire prevention measures, is the need for eradicating alien and invasive species, because not only do they consume a lot of water, so in terms of drought, for example, it creates a problem, but also they serve as biofuel, fuel for fires when there are felt fires. And especially with certain types of vegetation, you have the risk for fire spotting, which is when, due to the nature of some of the plants and with prevailing very warm winds, these pieces of plant material burn for much longer, and in the wind they get picked up and then deposited in another area, and then they start secondary fires as well, which often in cases where you have very strong winds, you will have the fire line that's progressing at such rapid rates, and it makes it very difficult to keep these natural disasters under control and bring the fires under control as well. And then it comes back to the fire ecology, which I mentioned earlier as well. I think a greater focus on regional planning for disasters is very important. I think we have so many pieces of legislation that provide for structures. In different cases, we've got a separate system for fire management, for example. But even if we look at the disaster management at a national level with requirements for provincial and local disaster management centers, all of these require a great amount of communication, coordination. And when those basic things are not in place, it means that the entire system collapses, and we lose time and we lose efficiency when we need to respond to these disasters. I think, so I think it comes down to communication and coordination as well. And then the other reality is, of course, improved access to funding and also better management at local government level. I think it was in the SONA of this year, where the president highlighted the poor performance of local government as one of the major factors impeding South Africa's development. So I think local government is the Achilles heel at the moment, and solutions and the problems around this sphere of government is quite complex. So yeah.
Yeah, Jean. Yeah, this is really concerning. You know, when you think of local government, let's say it's a municipality, they are planning how they execute their disaster preparedness and recovery, or the lack of effectiveness around them. It has a direct impact. For example, some of them, they are responsible for ensuring that there are fire breaks before the fire season. And then when there are no fire breaks that are prepared on time, including government agencies that are responsible for certain portions of land, then you have fire that burn because of the biofuel that builds up from poor maintenance of those tracts of land. Some of them, for example, they were complaining that ESCOM is no longer looking after the vegetation below their pylons. And ESCOM was saying that, no, but we don't have all the resources for all the kilometers and kilometers of network of power lines. But at the end of the day, you find that whatever happens there from municipalities affects other sectors. And one of the sectors that gets the raw deal from some of the things that municipalities are not doing is the agricultural sector. Because on one side, you have fires that are an extreme problem, and it results in heavy losses for farmers, whether big or small, or whether for commercial or subsistence. It's a big problem. But at the same time, on the other side, you also have these sectors having a responsibility for preparedness, as well as aligning with the Paris climate agreement. For example, the agricultural sector is one of those sectors that are contributing a lot towards greenhouse gas emissions through when you look at them broadly through the AFOLU. But Nontobe, what has been the agricultural sector doing to align with the Paris Climate Agreement, in particular South Africa's commitments through the nationally determined contributions to reduce greenhouse gases, as well as adapting?
So thank you, Joseph. So from a South African perspective, what we committed to was that we would develop national policies or strategies and plans that would, of course, be implemented in one way or another. So I think I know for a fact there was a strategy adopted or approved by Cabinet in 2020. And in that strategy, agriculture definitely was one of the sectors that were prioritized, given what you've just stated now. And in that strategy, there was a set of adaptation interventions that were supposed to be implemented. And I think the strategy document runs from 2020 to 2031. And I think as of now, there has been no real tangible indications on what has been achieved out of that. So it is, at least there is a strategy document adopted and approved, and we assume that it should be under implementation. And without jumping the gun also, I think this is another area for us in Parliament to kind of, keep a close eye on, in terms of what then becomes of all these nice policy documents and strategies that we have. But the specific interventions for the agriculture sector were supposed to be the development of an early warning system, particularly for small-scale farmers. And then there were supposed to be efforts or incentives put in place to support farmers who wanted to shift from conventional agriculture towards climate-smart agriculture. I think also another area where there is a gap. So we'll have a policy gap where, it hasn't been clearly outlined what the country is aiming for. But also, once we have a policy and a strategy adopted and approved, then moving towards implementation, we also do have a problem. But I think generally also within the South African public sector, there is also this idea that climate change is a topic for scientists to some extent, more or less. You would find very much research institutes and whether it's the Water Research Council, it's the Agricultural Research Council, you'll find, entities like that heavily involved in this kind of work. But to translate all of the nice work that happens there into actually implementable programs and projects from, government departments, whether at national, provincial, or even the local sphere, as you guys were discussing earlier, also we kind of do have that gap. So we don't have an integrated system, because if I were to speak of, there are definitely early warning systems available there. With a click of a button, you have the internet and all of that. But how does that flow back to an ordinary small-scale farmer, or, well, some commercial farmers, of course, who are well clued up on, recent technologies? I'm sure they use quite a lot of that. But so we also need to kind of, the small gaps that exist here and there. I think there's a room to improve on that, and to kind of try and close it up together. So yeah, I think also, just to come back to something, it's a question on the platform. I think Rasigan is asking on, how we can use true cost economics to estimate the actual full cost of persisting with the current minerals energy complex. And I think it's such a brilliant question. So I wouldn't answer you, Rasigan, from the minerals and energy complex, because I work in the agriculture sector. But that's exactly the point, that, when we look at food systems, we need to really reconsider the true cost of what it takes to produce a ton of maize, the amount of water, the amount of pesticides that have been used, and therefore, the runoff again into the ecosystem of those pesticides. The amount of fertilizer. But even before you consider the amount of fertilizer that you've used, you need to consider now the pre-production, the actual cost of producing a ton of fertilizer. Then you transport that from across the world. We import the majority of our fertilizer as a country. So when we say we are a food secure country, for example, from a maize perspective, but what is the actual true cost of that on the environment? And can we quantify that? And having quantified that, so when we say we have a very highly productive, when you look at the productivity of maize, for example, in this country, looking at commercial farmers, we would say they're highly productive, right? But also when you do take a step back with the idea of a food systems approach, then we really need to battle with these questions, and probably even dig deeper in terms of proper hardcore research for us to be able to quantify some of these things. So yeah, I think I'll stop there for now, Joseph. But yeah, I wanted to touch on that.
All right. Yeah, these things are really proving to be really complex, and the overlaps that exist between one issue and another issue, it's becoming really a bigger problem. We knew that climate change was a problem and its impact were a problem or a challenge. But now when you start looking closer to the challenges, you realize that you need a multifaceted approach to it, which means you need every affected and every sector to be involved, including from government side, so that from the adaptation and mitigation side, there is one voice and there is one common understanding in terms of what needs to be done at the policy level, then all the way down to the projects level. But some of these things that are happening, we are not exposed to them as to what are the success stories and that need to be multiplied or copied into other sectors. So, Tumani, are there any practical examples of adaptation and mitigation projects, like in South Africa, that demonstrate the importance of climate finance? Because it's one side to be considering the policy side, but we also need the side of the finances. Because, for example, the colleagues have been talking about the lack of preparedness and the shortcomings and the financial needs. But we also need to demonstrate as a country the understanding of the importance of climate finance from the adaptation and mitigation side of the projects. What projects do we have there, and how are they doing?
Thank you, Joseph, for that question. there are a couple of examples across the country insofar as climate finance is concerned with regard to the issues of adaptation and mitigation. I'm going to perhaps just use one example, although it's small money, small grant that was allocated to South African National Biodiversity Institute through the Adaptation Fund. They were implementing two. I think this project are still going on, or maybe one of them is still going on. But the one is Umungen Resilience Project, and the other one is the Community Adaptation Small Grants Facility Project, which I think started somewhere around 2014. It's an old project. And these projects, particularly the one on community adaptation small grants, it was all implemented in two provinces in Northern Cape, as well as Limpopo, in particular Mpane district, as well as Namakwa district. And this was funded at an amount of, I think, $100 US dollars, $100,000 US dollars. And the objective there was to increase the resilience and reduce the vulnerability of local communities, and also to increase to empower them really to identify and implement adaptation measures. So the things that they focused on is the issues that Notobeko is talking about, issues around climate smart agriculture, particularly targeting livestock and crop production. To an extent that this one in Namakwa district, some of the communities, because they were farming livestock, then because of heat waves, then they were at a point of losing a number of their livestock, large amount of livestock. And then through this project, then they were given the livestock that is that has resistance to heat waves. In other words, they were given these goats and sheep, which were then enabled them really to adapt and also to be resilient to climate impacts in that part of the country. And in Mpane district, the issues there were around issues of water supply, as well as issues of food security as well. So they were assisted with how to do gardening, and also to use the crops that are water efficient. And also they were assisted with issues of borehole drilling and all other resilience building capabilities. And all this point to a situation where if we have got the finances, it's just this. It's a drop in the ocean when it comes to issues of adaptation and mitigation in the country. But it's a demonstration enough that if we can dispatch enough resources towards climate finance, then we can achieve a lot insofar as resilience building and adaptation capacity is concerned. So these are some of the things that I think through the climate finance, we can really enable the country to move forward and really safeguard the country from disasters. As we can see, majority of the disaster relief efforts are hampered by the lack of funds, as we have heard from Jenny as well, that there are a lot of places that have been affected, but they cannot adapt, they cannot recover from these losses because of the lack of funds. So those are some of the examples that I've got that come out of top of my head now, Joseph. So I think that is adequate enough to demonstrate really the importance of climate finance in climate adaptation in South Africa.
It's the adaptation and mitigation. It's actually a key part of climate response. And looking at, for example, going to COP, one of the areas that will be focused on is ensuring that the transition to a low carbon and resilient future is fair and equitable, and that vulnerable countries are supported to develop sustainably and inclusively. And this is also true for us. We need to develop and in a sustainable way. And like you hear from the different colleagues that are already making inputs from different angles, but there are some of the things that may not necessarily need big monies that Jenny, you have touched on. I want to go back to that point. You said some of the things to mitigate maybe disasters include just the basics of the maintenance of the stormwater drains. But broadly, maybe looking at or adding on that one, what are the preventative measures that we can put in place to mitigate the impact or the extent of devastation of natural disasters that we are experiencing in South Africa?
Thanks, Joseph. I think the short answer to your question is that it's a simple question and it's got a simple answer, but it's going to be very complicated and it's going to require a lot of effort in order to get right. I don't want to repeat myself too much, but I touched on some of the things before. A lot of it comes down to local government performance. And it's a very, very complex environment. And the challenges in each municipality, although there are similarities, the realities are quite different on the ground. You will have one municipality where, for example, access to water services or sanitation services will lag far behind the national average. And in the one place, it could be just due to old infrastructure and not having sufficient funds to repair critical infrastructure. In another one, it might be drought conditions, that there literally is not enough water to provide to everyone, and they'll be using water tankers delivering water into JoJo tanks at key points. In another municipality, it might have to do with the nature of land ownership. If it's an area that is known for traditional land ownership. And in other cases, it might be due to the terrain. If it's a hilly environment, especially in KwaZulu-Natal or Limpopo or Mpumalanga, it's often the case where municipalities struggle with water pressure because and the amount of electricity it requires to pump water to such elevated levels for people to access water. So the problems sound quite straightforward and the solutions sound quite forward, but it's easier said than done. I think some of the things that I mentioned before that's relatively inexpensive just comes down to better planning, allowing development in areas that are less prone to natural disasters, especially in the case of rivers and watercourses and floodplains, considering those basic things when approving development applications. And also then streamlining these across different sectors. The issue around wetlands, for example, rehabilitating them and not destroying them, they play an enormous role in flood management, and they are there. We just have to look after them and not destroy them, and then they save us a lot of money in terms of preparing for floods, for example. And then coming back to the fire ecology issue, which I raised before, considering, and Notabeka is much better qualified in this area than myself, but considering the types of crops that are grown in different areas, considering the fire ecology type of the region and the risk that these provide in terms of veld fires. And then a recent study found that the majority of firefighting services at local governments were not functional, which is a major concern. I think with the vegetation types as well, with the rainfall differing as much as it does with the east-west gradient and the changes in the vegetation type, each area will require its own specialized preparations and response to wildfires, for example, or to flooding. I think the risk of flooding differs as much as the risk of wildfires across different municipalities. So using a one-size-fits-all model simply does not work. There is a need for more specialization in the nature and the way in which municipalities and provinces respond to issues. And as mentioned before as well, I think there's a greater focus on regional planning around these matters, where they take into account that ecological boundaries do not necessarily conform to provincial or local government boundaries. So there is an inter-boundary approach needed to effectively respond, and especially in terms of responding as soon as possible and effectively to these natural disasters. And then it all comes back to cooperative governance as well. I think we have all these legislative processes, we've got all these international commitments, we've got all these acts and bills trying to address lacunas in the existing regulatory environment. But at the heart of the issue is the fact that government departments and the different spheres of government are still not speaking to each other. We're looking currently at a very high level now, as an example, with the climate change bill, which is being processed through the National Council of Provinces at the same time as the Upstream Petroleum Resources and Development bill. And these, I mean, one could argue that these are fundamentally in conflict with each other, because their preamble, their focus, their primary goals differ so much, and it has such a broad effect on so many different stakeholders. You know, there is a need for greater alignment between legislation as well, especially if one wants to avoid situations where there's litigation around bills or acts. Yeah, and then of course improved access to funding and tracking and ensuring that the funding is actually applied as it should be. So yeah, I'm going to just stop there for now, not to go over time.
All right. Yeah. The one thing that maybe I forgot to emphasize, we have a question. We'll have a few minutes of question and answer as we are drawing closer to the end of our meeting. But I've already seen that in the Q&A platform, there's already interaction there, and we have time for that. But as we move closer to finding solutions, Ntobeko, there's been a few of these mentions, even from what you've been mentioning before, also from Jen, and there's some of the projects that Tomani touched on to kind of strengthen adaptation at municipal levels or in local communities. And some of the things Jen is already has already spoken of as recommendations, areas that need to be strengthened. One of the things that has been said is that consuming red meat has been one of the big drivers in emissions, while others were arguing that no, it's the grain sector. The grain sector emits a lot. And then these were basically driving towards a call of changing some lifestyle choices around food so that we have a sustainable and resilient future. So maybe briefly, what are some of the ways through which we should adapt to this changing climate so that we are less carbon intensive and that our food systems are sustainable? Yeah, there's no problem with switching diets. Of course, you can switch from maybe eating meat to be vegan or vegetarian. But then there are also other concerns to be considered there. Like I remember one of the debates that was that no, even for a vegetarian choice, you still have emissions because there's lots of inputs, like Ntobeko was saying, like the fertilizers. But yeah, coming back to this one of adapting or switching away from carbon-intensive food systems. Ntobeko?
So thank you, Joseph. I think earlier on, I tried to kind of, introduce the idea of localized food value chains. But beyond that, more indigenous, crops in our food system. And it's quite interesting because I think Well, with modern lifestyles and the convenience of consumer choices and all of that, that's where we find ourselves. But if you were to find yourself in any deep rural community, the diet choices there, they're quite varied and they're quite different. If you look, even in terms of health outcomes, I know South Africa, we do struggle with stunting in young children under 5. But also equally, we're seeing obesity in children becoming a concern coming up. So the idea that for consumers to have easy access and cheaper food should be the primary concern of our goal in terms of agricultural production and food systems. I think we need to revisit that. There needs to be some kind of balance. So, and I think it's common cause in any typical rural home, or where the diet is still more indigenous and less fast food, less convenience, less pre-packed, shop-packed kind of a diet, then you'll see there is a difference. So I think as a personal choice, yes, people are always up to try and make those changes. But I think we should be thinking more broadly and more systematically about these things. So it's not just as per individual choices, and that's fine, that's okay. But I think we need to think as a people, how do we, value food to begin with, so and it's so easy now, the whole idea of retail convenience. I think we've lost being able to truly understand and to value our food choices. I think going back to Tomani, when I speak of indigenous foods, whether it's your indigenous crops, even with meat, and there's nothing wrong with eating your meat, but we definitely know your poor goats, some of the sheep. What sheep do we have in the Karoo, the Karoo land, and all of that? So there are sustainable ways to grow food, whatever the food choices. At the end of the day, there are also sustainable ways to grow food, and we need to amplify those. I think where we lack proper interventions is scaling up those type of interventions. So they remain as small community projects here and there, and sometimes they would also be for genetic breeding kind of research projects, and then it ends there. But how do we take that, as a sustainable way of food production, and then we scale that up? And in scaling up, but we also make sure that such smallholder farmers have access to the local markets. So we create, a localized value chain that, and indirectly also it has economic spin-offs, of course. That's another topic. But I think from a sustainability perspective, there is a lot more than we can do. It's quite easy for someone to say, I'm eating sustainably when they're eating imported quinoa, for example. But the amount of thousands of kilometers that quinoa has had to travel, you lose some of the sustainability elements in that regard. So I would advocate for indigenous food choices and localized food value chains. Thank you.
Yeah, it's some of the points that you are raising, they are at the core of oversight and ensuring that there's a link between what is being planned or a strategy to what is happening on the ground, to ensure that this sustainability is not just up there as just strategies or plans or international commitments, but down here. That is where the role of oversight bodies come in. And looking, for example, at the finance side, there are billions and billions of rands that are being spoken of, that have been signed, that have been tentatively agreed to. Toman, how does Parliament monitor the allocation and the use of these funds?
Thank you. Thank you, Joseph. The role of Parliament as a lawmaker and oversight institution in climate finance, it's extremely important. And in particular, in monitoring the issue of South African Just Transition Program, which is financed by both public and private funds. As Parliament, we have got a responsibility to safeguard the rights of the people and ensure that there is no misuse of public funds. And also to monitor the government that it does not get into binding agreements and financial transactions that would burden the nation resources that we may end up struggling to pay in the future. So as it stands now, there isn't a clear mechanism in Parliament to conduct oversight or assess the climate or just transition funding. As we have just indicated now, that you hear or you learn from the media or the published media and so on, that South Africa has received so many billions. I think last week I was reading newspapers. I think I saw 10 billion from Germany to really assist us with the just transition, which is well and good. But the point is, we do not know the conditions attached to this as Parliament. And there is now a problem of lack of accountability when it comes to these fundings, because no one knows the conditions and attached to these funds. And there are many countries that are funding just transition in South Africa, both private and public. And the question is, at what cost? But apart from Parliament being conducting the oversight and all of that, Parliament is also supposed to be working with other parliaments across the world to secure financial resources for South Africa to adapt to climate change and also to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And COP28 provides a window for this effort really to garner the support. But to answer your question in brief, the current parliamentary program or configuration, so to say, it does not comprehensively provide for the aspects of oversight on climate change mitigation and adaptation with respect to finance because of the cross-cutting nature of climate change. It is currently dealt with at the Committee on Environment, Committee on Agriculture, and so on and so forth. So you may find that some aspects of climate change are dealt with at COCTA level. And there isn't a place where it's central, where all these issues are dealt with. And if you look at the committees that deals with the financial management, like the appropriations, SCOPA, and so on, there isn't a day that they say today we are going to deal with just transition or climate change finance. Because it's not provided for within the oversight and accountability model. So it's something that is, I think, within Parliament we need to relook at. But obviously, because of the window that we have got now approaching the 7th Parliament, we have got an opportunity now to reconfigure and then put the oversight and accountability model that really provides or centralizes all these issues that has to deal with climate change finance under one umbrella. So that is where it's at, Joseph. That is how Parliament conducts climate change oversight or finance currently.
Thank you, Tumani. That is a serious concern because we should not be tying the next generation and the following generations to loans that are undisclosed in terms of the interest that are being charged to them. Because, for example, some of these things, they were supposed, when some of these countries committed to financing adaptation and mitigation, there was no real talk of them being converted to loans. And then now when information suddenly comes up, then you hear that, oh no, the 8.5 billion rand is made up of loans, it's made up of some conditional grants, is made up of a tiny portion of donations, but the bulk of it is now loans. So it then talks to the core of the spirit of this financing mechanism that is there. It's also talking to the issues that the Parliament needs to do, for example, to mitigate or ensure that the oversight is a little bit strengthened to ensure mitigation and adaptation at a local level. Jenny, is there anything that you want to add in terms of Parliament strengthening its function?
Thank you very much, Joseph. I think my esteemed colleagues raised very important points, so I'm not going to belabor any of them any further. I think the issue that Tumani pointed out around the fragmentation of laws and approaches to the just transition in general and climate change, especially in Parliament when it comes to oversight, is an area which needs to be addressed. I think the flexibility required for responding to natural disasters is something that Parliament should also consider. I think a good example was the ad hoc committee on flood relief and response, which was formed by Parliament to track and monitor progress and funds being spent around the floods in KwaZulu-Natal last year. And I think having these specialized, focused, temporary committees being constituted for a specific purpose is a very good way to bring together different stakeholders and focusing on a specific challenge within a specified space of time. I think the local government crisis is such a cross-cutting issue that to some extent I feel that the current committees dealing with oversight over local government are stretched so thin that Parliament could consider having a specialized ad hoc committee just focusing on local government challenges and working with the right stakeholders to try and turn things around. And yeah, I think in terms of international cooperation, which is of course also a function of Parliament, I think there are major opportunities to leverage funding to reach better agreements, and especially international cooperation agreements with where South Africa can learn from other countries, and where support is not necessarily just provided in terms of finance, but also in terms of knowledge transfer. I think there are major opportunities, and especially around investment opportunities for renewable energy as well. But I'll stop there for now. Thank you.
Yeah, it looks like Parliament has its work cut out for it to ensure that is that there are some also be written comments there and questions that we will shortly switch to. But Nontobeko, before we switch to the comments in the section there, how can the country then leverage the agricultural influence to promote sustainable practices, particularly when you look at it from Parliament's role? Because it looks like we do have something that we can leverage on here.
So I think just to state the obvious, of course, in the main way, agriculture is definitely private sector led. So, you know, the role then directly within this space for Parliament, it's there, of course, but it would come with its own limitations. But I'm also thinking of how then in Parliament wanting to leverage, you know, what's possible within the agricultural value chain and food systems in general. Surely if we want, you know, agriculture to adapt and be more climate resilient, but not only just commercial agriculture, but smallholder agriculture as well, from the perspective of, you know, also ensuring that rural people's livelihoods are better secured and better protected into the long term. I think we should be thinking and considering, and we haven't seen this from the financing of climate change interventions, but some sense of a public-private partnership, but that has, you know, strong underpinnings of securing, yes, livelihoods, yes, food security, but also adaptation as an element. So I think that's one area that we could look at generally as a country, and then Parliament could, try to see how it oversights or plays a role in that regard. And I think earlier when Tomani was speaking about the 7th term of Parliament coming up, I think also it's an opportunity for all of us as knowledge workers on this platform, or generally across the Parliament community. It's an opportunity for us to be able to say, these are the issues that we are grappling with within the country, within the region, SADC, across the continent, or even globally. And therefore, how then does Parliament position itself and responds and becomes agile in some of the responses that are required in this space. And then the last thing I was thinking of is, we've heard before on how we need to have gender sensitive budgeting, for example. And so when you go to National Treasury, they'd be able to show you throughout national government how much of the budget allocated is actually geared, or at least is meant to be geared towards gender responsive or gender mainstreaming type of initiatives. And maybe then we should also, we could collaborate with our colleagues in the finance cluster, in the budget office, and kind of try to step back and see. So these are the budgets at national level, provincial level, local government. But how much of that is actually climate sensitive or climate change mainstreaming, for lack of a better word? But I'm sure eventually, the more we think about it, we could find a way. And out of that, not only on a climate change perspective, but to also say, we know for a fact that we are all affected by climate change, but the livelihoods of poorer households, or deep rural households, will be most affected, or already are most affected. Informal settlements, as Jeannie was saying, we know with the disasters, that's where the most damage is. And it's not a damage in terms of just infrastructure, but it's people's livelihoods, and it will set them back for another 3, 10, 15 years, whatever the case might be. So how then do we leverage the budgeting cycle and for us to be able to, pinpoint within that, how much of this is gender sensitive or gender mainstreaming, how much of it is climate sensitive, and that kind of thing. I think that's something that Parliament can definitely think of going into a 7th term. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, colleagues. We are approaching the end of our meeting, but there were some questions and comments that were made there in the section, so we'll now switching to them. I see that some have been responded to, and there is one by Gaugelo that is it possible for us to get copies of these inputs from the panelists? Yes, Gaugelo, we are going to combine the different inputs, and then they will be available on the Parliament's website, including this discussion. It's already recorded on Parliament's YouTube channel. So maybe for some other aspects that maybe were missed during the discussion, they will be there, but we're still going to put the content of the different inputs from the panelists into one document, and that will be available on Parliament's website. We hope to do this thing as quickly as possible. It's just that there's lots of parallel activities that we are involved in, but that will surely be there. And then there's a question from Rasigan, if that is the correct way of pronouncing. Apologies if I did not pronounce it correctly. I think, was it responded to? Yeah, but I think it was partially responded to, or it was responded to during the discussion around the budgeting of or the allocation of resources towards this. Tomani covered that extensively. And then it's the investment into research and development. I will give Nontobeko, 1 minute. Jean, 1 minute, and Tomane, 1 minute, to just touch on R&D. There's already an input that was made that there's investment into the infrastructure for early warning systems and fire detection. But just maybe if that is not already covered, please come in.
Definitely. I think if you look also whether it's the Agricultural Research Council, the CSIR, for example, our budgets towards research and development, but also with innovation, even if there are budgets, I would still maintain we struggle when it comes to scaling up and moving towards commercial viability. If we use water harvesting as an example, that's something that could work in many instances, whether it's rural communities, it's farmers, and that kind of thing. We have the innovation, but then how then do we, in making sure that whether it's our food systems or just general livelihoods, making sure that we build some resilient capacity within those. So added budgets, yes, but also towards the idea of scaling up and maybe commercializing some of these research and development outputs. I would put it there. Definitely more resilient seed varieties. We definitely need that. We won't pivot towards, sustainable food systems in a 3-year span. But if we invest and consistently invest on seed varieties, on indigenous genetics in terms of livestock, I think then we will get there.
Tomani, sir, 1 minute. Or if it's covered, then move the chair.
Thank you so much. I think I'm covered because I think the issue around that was relating to food security. But in terms of the other disasters like the floods and all of that, there is a National Disaster Management Center which provides the research around that and early warning system, including the South African Weather Services. So that is something that we invest. But I think the challenge it's in terms of dissemination of this information timely to the potential victims. So that is one thing that needs to be looked at. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I concur with my colleagues. I think the last point that I would maybe just reiterate is just to say that a lot of these solutions are often low-tech solutions, and we tend to look at technology to solve all our problems. But some of the solutions we already have, we're just not using it or implementing it in the correct way. And I think the other thing that I would maybe also just highlight is that while a lot of the solutions are often proposed and enforced top-down or from a higher level of authority or government onto a smaller and more localized scale, often the solutions come from individual case studies that start from a regional or a local perspective and local problems. So I think a greater cognizance and respect for the individuality of different cases, different regions, different towns, different municipalities. Often we can look and turn to them for finding solutions that are also applicable and relevant at a larger or a more national scale as well. So all the solutions don't always have to come from the top sphere of government.
Yeah, thank you very much, colleagues. Because I see there was also the question for Sukmani. Wanted to know about the role and support from government for nature-based solutions in addressing some of the issues for adapting to disasters. Yeah, I think this one was covered in different ways, although it was not directed to that question. But yeah, I think let me thank all the panelists that took their time to prepare for this meeting, and all the different guests from different walks of life for gracing this meeting. I will hand over to Esther.
Wow, Joseph and colleagues, let me just say what an inspiring and informative session. Thank you very, very much for all of your inputs. I think as the comments would also go in the comment box, it was really insightful and we gained a lot of insight. Thank you, more importantly, to the panel, to the participants here this afternoon who stayed with us for a full 2 hours. We really appreciate your engaging questions. We appreciate that you shared the time here with us. As Joseph said, what we will do after this is to try, and we do have a spot on the page of Parliament where we post all our information relating to webinars. So in a while, we'll be able to post all the information on there, the recording of the session, and so you will be able to access the information there. Thank you very much to a very competent also and knowledgeable facilitator this afternoon, Joseph. I know that a lot of work also went into it for you. Also, in addition to all the other parallel things that you are busy with at the moment. Thank you to our acting chief researcher. I think that we will include her in all our future webinars. I think it is the right thing to do. Thank you, Nadia, for also agreeing at short notice to be here with us today. Colleagues, I think that neatly brings us to the end of our webinar. I hope that you will go well from a wet and rainy Cape Town. Good afternoon and have a good evening. Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you, everyone.
Can I ask that the cluster just remains for a minute or two, please?
No, we can't remain on WhatsApp because this is live stream.
Oh, okay.
Collie, you can end.